All right, it says it's setting it up. All right, it should be live.
Yep, it says we're live.
All right, it should be live.
Ayuki, everyone. Welcome back to episode 3 of Indigenous Virtual Speaker Series, brought to you by Two Feathers Native American Family Services. I'm your host, Charlie Reed, and today I'll be co-hosting with none other than Dr. Virgil Moorhead Jr., the Executive Director of Two Feathers. Thank you for everyone joining us and being patient with us, as we are obviously running a little bit on engine time. You know, concepts of time isn't really a thing for us, so we're keeping it traditional, I guess you could say. Today we have a very special guest in Dr. Joseph Gahn. He's a professor of faculty art and sciences with emphasis in anthropology and faculty of medicine and global health and social medicine at Harvard University, where he is also the faculty director of Harvard University's Native American program. Dr. Gahn is also a member of the Ani Gros Von Tribal Nation. He's also a peacetime veteran of the U.S. Army and former West Point cadet. Currently, Dr. Gahn lives with his partner, Tia Miles, and their 3 children in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I believe. And so thank you, Dr. Joseph Gahn and Virgil, for organizing all of this, and I'm very grateful to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you for hosting us, Charlie. I'm glad to be part of this conversation with Dr. Gahn and really looking forward to his presentation.
Well, terrific. Thanks all for that warm welcome and the invitation to talk with you today. And of course, it's a crazy time. We're all going through an awful lot of disruption and chaos, and hopefully we're mostly well and able to keep social distance and able to care for family members and loved ones and friends who are in need this time. So I appreciate those of you who've been able to join us today for this exchange of ideas. I've been asked to present for, I'll think maybe 25 minutes or so, not the whole time by any stretch, just to get some ideas going. And then I'll really, at that point, look forward to a lot of exchange from anyone who's hearing this and has some questions or comments or reflections to offer to the group more generally. So as you can see, I'm talking to you today about rethinking American Indian mental health. And so I have a slideshow today that should help us to get through some of this. As I think probably this audience knows, we have some really clear disparities in American Indian mental health status. In too many of our communities, we have epidemic levels of distress that is often realized in particular through high prevalence of trauma and substance abuse and suicide. And yet the mental health services that are on offer in most of our communities to try remedy these problems are deeply underfunded. And that means there's really a large unmet need when it comes to mental health concerns in Indian country. So you might think then that when it comes to this issue of American Indian mental health disparities, that on the one hand, we have these pronounced mental health problems in many of our communities. On the other hand, the services that are on offer to remedy them are underfunded. So why not just properly fund and expand the mental health service system? Isn't that the obvious solution? Well, I'm certain that that can help. But for reasons that I'll now explain in the rest of our time where I'm talking to you, I want to tell you why I think it may not be such a simple solution. And so the reason I think that comes from really early lessons I learned in my career. In fact, it was in the late 90s that I did some work on my own home reservation, the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana, in which I undertook a project, the goal of which was to explore in discovery-oriented, open-ended fashion among my own people, particularly an extended family group on my reservation, local understandings of American Indian culture, drinking, and depression. So I was interested in trying to understand on the ground and in people's own perceptions and experiences how they made sense of the relationship and associations between indigenous culture, drinking, and depression at Fort Belknap. And this was different than how psychologists usually conduct inquiry or research. In this sense, it was much more anthropological. In fact, I was interested in understanding what anthropologists refer to as explanatory models for different kinds of medical problems. An explanatory model is the way someone on the ground and in their own lives make sense of the rise of a certain kind of illness or disorder, how they explain it, how they think it should be treated, and so on. And I was also wanting to attend to another concept that comes to us from medical anthropology, which is known as idioms of distress. An idiom of distress is a particular way that some people in some communities might express their distress that differs or contrasts with people in other communities. A big way to think about this is in much of the modern, wealthy, affluent nations, people express distress in psychological terms through feelings that they can talk about. But in lots of the world, people don't normatively talk about their feelings of distress. Instead, they'll complain about back problems and headaches and bodily dysfunctions of various sorts. And so that's an example of an idiom of distress. So again, I was interested in trying to, in my own community, understand the relationships between indigenous culture, drinking, and depression in open-ended fashion. And during this project, what I ended up doing was focusing on an in-depth case study with one particular individual who, in our work together, elected to go by his Indian name, Traveling Thunder. Traveling Thunder was a middle-aged, monolingual English-speaking Assiniboine Gros person from the reservation. He was a grassroots activist, which is to say that he was engaged in some activities that were trying to improve the community. In particular, he was wanting to stop some destructive gold mining that was happening in the mountains that are adjacent to the reservation. And he was a self-identified traditionalist, which is to say that he rejected Christian doctrine, which of course had been circulating in Indian country for a long time now, and was very much interested in looking back to indigenous tradition for making his way through life. And what was interesting to me is I was asking Traveling Thunder about how he understood the relationships between indigenous culture and drinking and depression. He offered an explanatory model, a way of thinking about these things that really was structured through history. In particular, he talked about 4 different historical eras that traced out these links in a discourse of distress or an explanatory model that was unpacked as follows. Traveling Thunder basically said that there was a time before the white man came of paradise, of pre-colonial existence when Indian people lived in harmony. Here's specifically what he had to say about that. Quote, "See, there was no alcohol on this continent 500 years ago. There was no drugs. There was no problems, no domestic problems, no social problems. Everything was good because everybody lived according to custom and teachings. And there was no jails, no hospitals, there was no prisons, no insane asylums. There was none of that stuff because everybody lived according to a strict custom." So here we see in this first historical epic that Traveling Thunder referenced, an emphasis on perfect harmony and balance owing to strict observation of custom. That's indigenous custom, indigenous cultural tradition and practice. But it didn't stay that way. Traveling Thunder went on to talk about a second historical era, one marked by conquest in the wake of colonial contact. And here's what he had to say about this second historical period. Quote, "But when the white man came, they forced the Indian people to get rid of their way, their religious spiritual beliefs. They forced them to trade their economy, which was based on the barter system and on living off the land, the wildlife, fish, and herbal medicines. Then they turned around and forced their culture on them, their religion, their beliefs, their foreign ways onto them by taking all the young people out of the homes and putting them away in boarding schools and forcing the white man's teachings on them. It's genocide." So in this era, the era of contact and conquest, Traveling Thunder emphasized an annihilation of custom that resulted from the colonial era. The custom that kept things in harmony now had been undermined. And the predictable outcome of this period was a third era, one characterized by loss, that is the after effects of colonization. And here's what he had to say about that. Quote, "If you don't know your own true oral history, your true oral traditions and customs and where you come from and what's supposed to be important to you, well, you're going to feel empty. You're going to feel like you don't belong because we don't fit in with the white man's system. We never did and we never will. It basically boils down to pride. If people ain't proud of who they are, where they come from, what they're doing, then they're going to be doing these things: alcohol, drugs. And once you're into alcohol and drugs, you're going to probably get into a depression, and you're going to not feel worthy of being a human being, and you're going to want to kill yourself. So here, in charting out the after effects of colonization, this era of loss, he really highlighted an explanation that's grounded in what we refer to as anime. Anime means no name, which really has to do with loss of identity, purpose, belonging, and orientation to life. And he was saying it's this anime that leads to pathology of the different things, alcohol and drugs and so on. And more specifically, he identified the white man system as pathogenic, as the source of the problem in this instance. So anime leads to pathology, and it's the white man system that causes this anime. Fortunately, Traveling Thunder didn't see that as the final stage that we were in. In fact, he identified a fourth historical era, an era characterized by revitalization in a way that maybe could remedy the kind of colonial situation that our community found itself in. Here's what he had to say, quote, "After we looked around and realized that we left something behind, we started going back to the hills to fast. We started going to the sweat lodges to pray and to sweat. We started going to the elders to learn. We never was happy living like a white man. I would give the credit to the Creator and to the spirit world for pitying the people to allow us to get our sacred traditions back. To me, what that ceremony does is you're calling on the Creator, the spirit world, for life, or for good health, or for a good, clean mind, an alcohol and drug-free mind. Or you're calling on the spirit world for guidance, or for survival even survival." And so Traveling Thunder recognized that in this fourth era, an era since the Red Power movement of the 1970s, when Indian people started to be more interested in revitalizing their indigenous culture and traditions, that this return to sacred custom could in fact bring about a restoration of our communities in the wake of the loss that the colonial encounter had led to. And so just to better unpack more explicitly Traveling Thunder's explanatory model about the links between indigenous culture, drinking, and depression, he posited a very clear pathological process. He talked about the colonial encounter resulting in cultural repression that then leads to anime, loss of name or loss of purpose and identity and belonging and so on, that then would lead to substance abuse, and then to depression, and then to worthlessness, and then to suicide. I showed you in his quote that sequence is exactly what he had to say. So this is a clear process he was able to overtly and explicitly trace. Interestingly, Traveling Thunder had very little to say in any detail about personal distress. He didn't talk about biology much in the way that mental health professionals do today, who think about chemical imbalances in the brain or even genetic predispositions to different kinds of problems. Nor did he really even offer much of a psychological account in terms of defense mechanisms or traumatic feelings, things like that, early family history. Instead, as you could see, he emphasized history, culture, and spirituality in offering this particular explanation for the origins of problem drinking and depression on the reservation. He also, of course, highlighted the pathogenic aspects of the white man system. He was clearly identifying colonization as the original and primary cause of native distress. And in doing so, he emphasized systemic factors over intrapersonal factors. He was talking about the aspects of the white man system and the way that system is set up to govern and even to really subjugate reservation life. He wasn't talking about things inside people, but things, the setting in which people were living at that time. And in doing so, he was highlighting shared community vulnerabilities. This isn't this one or that person or that individual. It's the entire community who has outcomes or impacts from the systemic aspects that we've described. And so if you think about historical trauma, which of course is a much more current way of talking about this sort of causal explanation, it's very, very similar. In fact, it sort of predates it a little bit in terms of when I was able to encounter this concept. But there's one key difference that's worth pointing out, which is that historical trauma has right in the concept itself the idea of psychological trauma, which is a psychologized concept. Traveling Thunder talked about everything else that historical trauma captures, except for the trauma. He really didn't talk about psychology much at all. Well, you might be wondering, as I did, and hearing about this understanding, what the relevance would be then of mental health services, of counseling and therapy, and psychosocial interventions more general. So I asked Traveling Hunter, I said, okay, given what you're saying here, if you had a loved one who was going through a really tough time and you were actually quite worried about them, under what conditions would you take them down to the IHS clinic in behavioral health and get them a counseling or therapist? What kind of help, under what conditions would you take them down to do that? Well, he grew quiet and he thought for a long minute before speaking quite soberly. And here's what he had to say. I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out, and therefore the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. We look at the big picture, you look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future where the white man's leading you. I guess you could make a choice. Where do I want to end up? I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it'd be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrists in the Indian Health Service and say, I'll go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. I guess that would be a choice each individual will have to make. So in this final response to my query, Traveling Thunder very clearly identified mental health treatment as a cross-cultural encounter. So there's a white man way of doing this that may, might interface with Indian people in an unexpected way. But not only that, that mental health services are actually a form of ongoing colonization. That these approaches involve brainwashing in a way that we might interpret as a kind of implicit Western cultural proselytization. Proselytization means like missionary work, trying to convert people to a different way of being and thinking and living. And in some ways, Traveling Thunder was pointing to white psychiatrists in the Indian Health Service as engaged in that very kind of activity. So I opened up with talking about the inequities in our system. And I talked about maybe the problem with these inequities is simply that the services aren't funded enough or could simply be expanded. But I think in the wake of hearing what Traveling Thunder had to say, it seems clear to me that it's not that simple. We have first the problem of cultural difference. Of course, Indian communities and, people who came from European communities really originate from really historically distinctive cultural enclaves. And these cultural differences really persist in cultural practices today. Some of the things that I've studied on my own reservation that are sort of psychological can also be traced back to cosmology. And you can see elements or traces of that stuff in mythology and in religious understanding. And so these cultural practices, can trace through all domains of life and experience. What's clear really is that the culture of the mental health clinic is not the culture of the Native community in most instances, at least a part of the Native community. And that's what Traveling Thunder was saying. So we have this problem of cultural difference. You might think the problem with cultural difference can be solved just by getting people together and getting a mutual understanding and working it through. But the problem here now in Indian country is that we also have a long legacy of cultural dominance. We have all experienced various forms of colonial subjugation. You, of course, are mostly familiar with the boarding schools, which were built under the slogan, kill the Indian, save the man. And so we still today exist with really enduring power asymmetries between tribal life, tribal communities, tribal governments, and tribal sovereignty, and US Congress and the rest of the nation. And so the problem of cultural dominance colors these differences in ways that make it that we can't simply approach each other on equal footing and arrive to a breezy mutual understanding as a solution. All this has led me to describe this situation of Indian mental health services as one afflicted by a post-colonial predicament. And you can see here I put the post in parentheses because it's not entirely clear that colonization is over. And in some ways, that's not. Even as in some ways it sort of is, so it kind of depends here. But my idea with this post-colonial predicament is to capture the fact that on the one hand, we have really urgent community needs. We tend to live in impoverished, high-risk settings. We have these documented disparities in mental health status. But on the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer or that are provided to try remedy these are often incongruent. That's what Traveling Thunder meant when he said that going to see IHS therapist was an invitation to brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. And this sense of incongruence is attested to by more than just Traveling Thunder. And everywhere I go in Indian country, people sometimes say similar things. But also, this has been picked up in research studies, where in some instances, community members has been asked, who would you want to turn to in a time of mental health crisis? And they will list, 12 different kinds of people before they ever mention a mental health worker or a mental health professional. And I think, again, that's attesting to the fact that these services are seen to be incongruent in some important ways. All of this, in some ways, for the remainder of my career, has anchored a way of understanding Indigenous mental health in really an alternative or alternative frame of reference. Because as you'll see, there's, I think, a parallel Indigenous way of thinking about these problems, a science, as I put it here, that's quite different than what psychiatry and mental health professionals typically offer. So in this sense, the problem from this alternative Indigenous perspective is not mental disorders like the DSM classifies or professionals will diagnose, but historical trauma. And the aspiration for well-being, or what you were aiming for in terms of wellness, is not neoliberal individualism, which is, free agents navigating free markets in pursuit of happiness and wealth, which is pretty common in lots of other parts of America and other affluent nations, but rather a different aspiration, one that tries to return to Indigenous forms of self and personhood that are deeply connected with other people and other places even. This alternative suggests that the intervention or the treatment is not empirically supported, therapies, for example, but reclaimed healing practices that draw on Indigenous therapeutic traditions. And even the means of evaluating what works or what doesn't, or what do you think would be the best thing to do, is not so much scientific studies and research, but rather Indigenous ways of knowing. So I think what I'm describing to you today from Traveling Thunder has anchored or settled an entire frame in which there's an alternative Indigenous science to contend with and to address in this instance. I've written about this and lots of other related things, and a lot of this is available for download on my website. But for now, I think I'll stop and invite you to offer reflections and comments for the remainder of our time together. And so in doing so, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have more of an exchange and see better who's who and what's what. Thanks for listening.
Charlie, I think you may be on mute. Thank you, Dr. Gahn, for that fabulous presentation. I think how we'll go from here is we'll shoot some questions, and Charlie's going to have the first question. And on our presentations or our virtual speaking series, we've had our college mentors come up with questions that we asked all speakers. And so Charlie's going to ask the first question and take the lead from there.
Yeah, what I was saying before I was muted, I just wanted to thank you. And I said Yotwa, that means thank you in the Kaduk language. And, one of the questions that we kind of come up with is, when we're working with our tribal youth, we understand, kind of how hard it could be for them to like engage into, the traditional therapy, like one-on-one conversation, talk therapy. And we already know as Indigenous people that only works for a certain amount of people. And especially when, you're coming from, a lot of immense trauma in your background, your life. And so I'd love it to hear from you, like what ways, kind of expand more about how Indigenous ways of knowing impacts our approach to kind of talk about mental health and, really engage with the youth more effectively rather than, Western medicine ways.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm sure there are some subset of our youth who are really troubled and in some respects have been hurt, by early childhood kinds of experiences, and where the opportunity to try work with someone they really trust and to have an opportunity to have an experience of a different kind of relationship that in some ways can be repairing in the way therapy sometimes can be is probably a good thing. But the truth is that no amount of mental health services will solve the problems of Indian country. Our problems come from deep structural disadvantage and inequality and a long history of colonization that colors our experiences and our mindsets and our life ways in really dramatic ways. And so in terms of how to work with youth in particular for navigating those, I mean, youth and young people in general are just more fragile, more vulnerable because they're trying to figure out how to live life. And that's true if you don't have a colonial background. I mean, it's in the younger years that people's lives go off the rails more so than later in life once you're established. But if you have all this adversity in your life already at such a young age, it's even somewhat more likely you're going to go off the rails at some point. So a good part of working with youth, I think, outside of therapy now, is the opportunity to try to make sure that youth are doing something that keeps them engaged in some meaningful way and out of trouble. I mean, we already know that one big way youth get into trouble, it's very common even when you don't have a colonial background, is that especially young boys or young men, get entangled with the law for doing stuff that's illegal. And, as we all do, sometimes we're younger acting like knuckleheads. And so there's a whole series of things one can do. One is to try to keep young people engaged in pro-social community positive activities, so they're less likely to, out of boredom and not having anything to do, find their way into trouble. And also, this is really important, is if you are able to set up a way to divert young people who do get into trouble away from the justice system, so they're less likely to get stigmatized and labeled and enter into that system, that has a way of creating almost a self-fulfilling prophecy over time once you end up in that kind of predicament. So those are two things that come to mind. I think a lot of programming is good. The other thing about especially adolescents and young adults is it's easy in a professional mindset to think we're the experts and know what people should do. But with young people, especially younger people, it's really important that they decide what they want to do. So it's more like resourcing, facilitating, guiding, supporting, that kind of stuff, and then trying to help them get set up what they want to do, because that's what's going to work in the maximum way. And I think in that sense, it often means having a youth council or setting up a youth leadership group where they choose among themselves who's going to help guide these kinds of things. And of course, you offer guidance and support and feedback and the money that's needed to do these things in this space. But it's all about apprenticing them to take on the obligations, responsibilities of adulthood in ways that are going to be good for them and for their communities and all of us over time.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that kind of speaks to what we do at Two Feathers with our mentorship program. I think a lot of the times we like to just see what they're interested in and like kind of nurture that relationship with the culture. So then that way you're not like forcing them to do something and then that causes like a burnout, or, like that relationship isn't as sustainable as it is as if you just kind of approach it with like curiosity and what if we do this, and kind of, like scaffold a little bit as far as being a part of that process with them. So then that relationship is for a longer time than just, well, every summer, come to this camp and then you're good. That's all you have to do. It's really about what happens in the moments between. And that's what I like about our mentorship program at Two Feathers is I work with some kids and, it's awesome for me to be a part, like partaking in something that I value as a Native man, and also like kind of giving that passion off to the kids that I work with, like even if it's fishing, and then they have like a sense of responsibility to their family, providing nourishment, and also participating in the cultural activity. And so that's something that, Western mental health really fails to make. It's more like, tell me how you feel. What are you thinking? Like, how does that make you feel? And which is helpful. I think that helps them like articulate and have like narratives that kind of speak to who they are and what they represent. And then it kind of relinquishes some power. So I see the positive sides of it, but at the same time, it comes with that wraparound type of effect to where then you're bringing everything together and supporting their families at the same time. I think that is something that's going to cause effective change, just having that balance, just like anything. So I like how you mentioned that. It really got me going, my own little thought processes.
So I could do the next question, Charlie?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So the next question that we created, which is maybe we'll pivot a little bit, but maybe not so much. But what do you see, or, what the specific question is, what is one word that explains what it means to be indigenous to you? And so one word, and then our follow-up question will be to unpack why you chose that word, and elaborate a little bit on indigenous, what it means to be indigenous, maybe indigenous identity. Yeah. So what is the one word?
Yeah. Well, this is one where if you had sent this in advance, I could have given a little more thought, but it's a great question. I like it. And the challenge is to pick a distinctive word. So the word that really comes to mind first is related, because I think actually what it means to be Indian more than anything else is to be a member of an extended Indian family. I think our lives, our communities, our social life is organized by extended families, more so even than tribes. But it's also the case that almost anyone could say related because everyone has a family, whether they're indigenous or not, and so on. But maybe I just mean shaped and contoured the way indigenous families tend to be, which can be distinctive from mainstream American families in all kinds of ways. There's also, I suppose, an underside here, which is to say another word that could come to mind would be colonized. I mean, that's another thing that I think most indigenous peoples share in common. You can quibble about what specifically you mean by colonized, and therefore maybe you could find a few who haven't been in some classical sense. But most indigenous peoples have been subjugated by other peoples and nation states in ways that were not of their own making, and therefore through that history and legacy of subjugation have the fallout and consequences of it in the way Traveling Thunder talked about, loss and the post-colonial effects. But also are struggling for overcoming marginality and poverty and disadvantages of various sorts to have their share of societal opportunities and resources. And so that strikes me as another word that one could use, although that emphasizes, I suppose, the more negative side of it. The truth is that I don't really like the word indigenous so much because I think it's such a broad, overarching term. It really arises from the political movement of peoples around the world banding together to articulate a common cause. But of course, on the ground in a given community, we have our specific causes that are kind of, tied to our own particular histories and legacies and the government structures we're trying to interact with and laws and economy and all those kinds of things. So, when I describe myself, I tend to think of myself as an American Indian more than an indigenous person, because even American Indian is a fiction, but it's one that has a whole set of precedents and understandings in American law and American history that we utilize and mobilize to express sovereignty and practice survivance every day.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are things that, could talk a lot about, is just like kind of how you conceptualize what it means to be Native, and I feel like a lot of times when I talk about that conversation, it's like, well, anyone could say they're Native to America if they're born in America, so it kind of, there's a lot of debate as far as what those concepts mean, but I do like hearing more and more about that, like just as I progress in my, professional development. So thank you for that. Any other questions, Virgil?
I wanted to follow up on one of the things that you said in your presentation was the forms of selfhood for as Native people or indigenous people, and you said that the pursuit of an intervention is maybe not so much towards that sort of neoliberal individualistic aspiration for many Native communities or peoples. I was wondering if you can unpack a little bit what those alternative forms of selfhood would be, and really specifically in 2020, in the sense of we're very multicultural hybrid communities. And so what would those alternative forms of selfhood are what would we be aspiring to become?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest distinction that I do think persists for many people today in tribal communities is a kind of extensive sense of self in relationship to others. Now, psychologists often talk about this as individualism or collectivism as the contrast, and there's other ways to describe that contrast too. But what's interesting that you don't always learn as you think about those psychological terms is that most human beings are capable of either of those modalities. It's really about the priming and about how much time you spend in either of those modalities. What's the default or most comfortable modality? So it's not either or. Some people are only collectivists and others are only individualists. No, we all have those tendencies, I think. In indigenous community life, though, I think it's the case that we tend to have a self in relationship to others such that identity becomes more distributed, it almost exists beyond our own individual minds and our own individual experiences to be in relationship with others. And those others could be family members and other human kin or close humans that we were with, but of course it's beyond the human. For most indigenous societies, whether you think of it as a Christian God or your indigenous notions, religious notions of the divine, of the book of various gods or various beings that we're in relationship with, and with lands too. Which in many respects are understood to be living themselves. Some landforms are living, and maybe you're in relationship with persons like that. And I'm mindful too that there's been a lot of shift, and so that probably is the one I would center on for 2020. It really isn't that long ago that, and some still probably persist in some communities that look really quite different. Like I'm thinking of among an anthropologist did some work among the Greenland Inuit communities, just about naming practices. And what this was in the 1980s, so not that long ago. And in the 1980s, these Greenland Inuit communities still were observing the practice of when someone in the community died, the next child that was born would be named after that person. It doesn't matter if you're in the same family. It doesn't even matter if you're in the same community, because it was a whole network of communities in that part of Greenland. But it wasn't just in honoring or commemorating. That new child with that new name was understood to be that person coming back through that individual. So in some sense, the identities of the old deceased person and the identity of the newborn get fused in a way that the relatives of this deceased person who might live 2 communities away would send gifts to the newborn out of honoring and recognition that their deceased ancestor was back. So you can start to see how identity can be distributed beyond, what we think of in the West, I guess, which is one name per person. This is an instance where I think about our own ancestors, where names changed throughout the course of your life. I had a great grandfather named Lamebull, but his original name was Underbull. He was changed to Lamebull because he got lame in one of his legs at one point in life. So, even just thinking about something as simple and straightforward as a name and the way we fix it on a birth certificate today, and all your documents better line up, and the airline wants exactly as it appears on your passport, which is a very different view than people who know you your whole lives in face-to-face ways, and you can have 6 names over the course of your life, but they all know who you are.
Thank you. One of the follow-up questions that's just coming, because I feel like what I took from you is just the, being very fluid and very not sort of stuck in a category, such as the name changing throughout one's lifetime, which is, maybe a little different than, let's say, something like diagnostic categories where you can be defined as you're bipolar or you're depressed. And so that's all to say that I think it seems to me that a lot of what we're doing in American Indian mental health is creating new programs, creating new interventions that use the past and our history and our cultural traditions, but also merge that, interweave that with our current times. And so my question and maybe, asked of you is to talk a little bit more about what you did in the urban clinic in Detroit and some of the interventions that you worked in collaboration with some of the leaders in that clinic. Because I thought, personally, that was pretty innovative and you're still doing that. I think that worked. So maybe just talking a little bit more about that work.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So it was over a decade ago now that I met with the executive director of the Urban Indian Health Clinic in Detroit, and we were together considering a grant opportunity, a small grant opportunity, and we wanted to talk about what we might be wanting to do together as a project. And it was supposed to be a health project. And it took us all of 10 minutes to settle on, we really wanted to think about how to incorporate indigenous traditional healing or therapeutic practices into the operations of the clinic in some way, shape, or form. So that project took shape, and it was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years in the making. Ultimately, what we ended up doing, though, was the leaders of the clinic, given a number of options that arose over the course of our early inquiry, really mandated that they wanted an opportunity for members of the urban Indian community in Detroit, many of whom were intergenerationally removed from ancestral homelands and from elders and knowledge keepers of various sorts. They wanted an opportunity for them to get exposed and oriented to indigenous traditional spirituality. So they commissioned us to come up with a program that would help do almost indigenous spirituality 101 for members of the urban Indian community. So in addition to that, we were interested in trying to develop a curriculum around that could be replicable and portable to other urban Indian communities. So it wouldn't be just Detroit, it could go to other ones as well. So there was, it was a year in the making, maybe 2 years in the making. They identified a ceremony guy they wanted us to work with who did, sweat lodges and so on. And we consulted very carefully with him around a curriculum. How would you try to capture the basics and then build up from the basics to the sweat lodge ceremony itself? Most people who practice sweat lodge ceremonies recognize that there's lots of pieces to it. There's prayers, there's smudging, often there's a pipe ceremony that happens in there, etc. And so our curriculum, which was basically 12 weekly sessions, 3 hours each session, goes over all these components and then builds them up into participating in a full-blown sweat lodge. And so it's meant to be done in a way that's totally structured and not to presume that a person who's participating knows anything about these things. Because as some of you might know, in our home communities, often it's used as a form of currency, almost of authority, to point out who really knows the real thing and who doesn't. And it's not really conducive in a community where people don't know much to kind of throw your weight around and make people feel bad for what they don't know. So we really were emphasizing heavily in this curriculum the assumption that we shouldn't even know that a person knows what to think about God. And of course, our job was to tell them what to think about God exactly, but to try to outline perhaps some traditional understandings a little bit. And what does it mean to pray? How do you pray? What does a prayer sound like? To give an example, because who knows if someone has even heard a traditional prayer coming from an urban setting where they've been, there for generations. So that was the goal. We were able to pilot it with a group of 10 folks from the community, because we had no idea when we mapped all this out. Can this really work? Like, will people come? Will it? Because think about what you need for this. I mean, I'm an academic. I do research. I can't run ceremonies, So, and people in Indian health weren't running ceremonies either. So we had to find people who we wanted a man and a woman team who were familiar enough with ceremony that they could run this program and the ceremonies too, or at least run the program and coordinate with ceremonial people. And they found the perfect couple to do this who were, not super old, but old enough and experienced enough, but also kind of learning in some ways themselves, that they were a perfect bridge between people who really knew very little and an elder who would know everything. And, we did interviews after the end of and there were rough spots where a lot of people are going through a lot of struggles, as you know, everywhere in Indian country. So some people couldn't come as often as they hoped. And, they were going through struggles of various kinds. But when we did the interviews, people said amazing things about how transformative this thing was for some of them. And it's one of the proudest things I've ever been involved in. And again, it wasn't me. I mean, I'm just one person of a team of people, most of whom had the knowledge that it took for this to happen. But I was there again to kind of resource, to facilitate, to guide, to document, just to kind of help it all take shape. And in some ways, that's my view of what we can be doing in Indigenous mental health outside of therapy and services proper, is trying to develop these kind of new programs and interventions that you're talking about that require partnerships with other people in the community who are the experts around some of these things. It's a pooling of expertise, and it's a drawing out and structuring of that expertise in ways that can benefit our people.
And you mentioned the word transformational. I know there's different, types of healing modalities and ways. Could you talk a little bit more about or unpack the transformational part of healing that's in many indigenous communities?
Yeah. Well, in recent years, I've started to talk about traditional healing or even traditional doctoring practices that I've encountered in all of the work that I do, and where I've been given either permission or it's public already. So I am not violating anyone's confidence when I talk about those things. But it's interesting to watch how what we think of as traditional healing has changed over the past century, 2 century, 3 centuries. I think of it on the Northern Plains where it's still practiced in some of our communities. But where even there, I've seen it change in some important ways. And so, it used to be that our medicine people were like our doctors, so if you have a broken arm, they can help set a broken arm. I mean, those kinds of things. Traditional medicine people today don't really do those things because we have biomedicine. So one of the big shifts that's happened in the past, 100, 200 years is the rise of biomedicine and its ability to be very, very useful for some things like infectious disease. Through vaccination, you can prevent that. And Indian people don't necessarily turn to traditional healers for those kind of things as much anymore unless they don't have access to biomedicine. So what this has done is created what I think is a helpful distinction drawn by the anthropologist Jim Waldron between restorative healing and transformative healing. And his point is that back in the old days, indigenous healing practices were often restorative, curative. That is, you're sick and the doctor makes you well. In modern indigenous therapeutic or healing practices, it's often not a cure for a very concrete problem that you're trying to get from. It's more transformative, which is it's trying to alter your way of seeing the world and the way of understanding your place in it and your experience of it. And so it ends up being more like a lifelong journey that gets altered, and so that you're moving toward different ends in a purpose-driven way in connection with the spirits and so on. So transformative healing is more about the kind of journey and purpose and meaning and living well and living right, as opposed to the old-fashioned way of restorative, which was just a cure for an illness. And in this day and age with biomedicine, it's usually less of an emphasis on a cure for an illness, more on helping you to live a good life.
Thank you.
I had just a personal question, as I mentioned in like the preliminary conversations we had before going on live. But I was just wondering, from an academic perspective, as a fellow academician myself, I'm just wondering, how have you been creative with ways to make sure that the literature that gets produced from this processes is kind of given back to the community? Because that's what I'm really big about, is just how inaccessible some of the jargon and some of the verbiage can be. Like, I always think about, how can I deliver this message to where my aunt can understand what I'm trying to say? Because oftentimes she's my source of knowledge. And so how do I give back that information to the greater community? So I just want to pick your brain a little bit in that aspect.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think, given the colonial legacy and the ways in which research has been really one-way driven for a lot of the history of research in Indian communities, that current ethical expectations are that research at least should be offered as a participatory process. Participatory process means that it's really collaborative and a partnership with people in the community who decide together what shape the research should take, what directions to go, how to proceed, and so on, and for whom there's an accountability by the researchers to return knowledge findings. Maybe they own the data or keep the data. They're involved in analysis. They give feedback on manuscripts and things like that. Note that I think it's a partnership, and I think that there's a sense in which it's been the spirit of relationship that involves trust and a willingness to be mutually accountable. So in some sense, I'm not really talking about where a tribal community is hiring a researcher consultant and has all the say because they're paying for everything and they decide it's my way or the highway. That's not exactly what I'm talking about either. I'm really talking about a partnership where everything's a negotiation. But in terms of how to get this back, so I think anytime we have published like with the Sweat Lodge program I just talked about, or with the Blackfeet Culture Camp that we did. When we publish stuff that's community-based, we always, in addition to the article itself, write a cover sheet of a page, usually not more than a page, single-spaced, that really tries to summarize and highlight and draw out the main points in more understandable language so that we can return that. And that can be published in the community newsletter or whatever in a way that just helps to explain what we found. We've also done presentations back to the community partners where, and they'll have a community feast and anyone from the community can come and we go through what we've learned and where we're at and where we hope to go and offer, accept or request feedback. And then like the curriculum for the Sweat Lodge, I don't own that, that was a joint creation of all of this whole team. And so we all have a part in that. And I would not just like give that away to someone without talking to the people we developed with first, these are things that we developed together. And so there's that relationship that's required to observe in a way that is good and appropriate. Now, that's not to say you can't imagine a tribal community saying, well, we want this work done, just get to it, don't bother us, we're busy. And that's okay if a tribe wants that. The point is that the tribe or a community should be offered the opportunity to have a participatory process if they want it. And if they don't, that's okay, but at least it's been offered.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that's important to always consider when you're coming from this, historical standpoint. If you think about it in the long terms, like there hasn't always been a great or fair relationship amongst academians or anthropologists or historians with indigenous people, because I feel like a lot of times in like early academia, it's always been extractive, like let me subject them, let me like objectify them and put my own understanding from a non-biased perspective on them and marginalize them and like box them, put them in a different category. And it's like another form for me is another form of dehumanization. So I think that's why I always want to pick different like Native academians' brains as far as like different creative strategies. And so that's what I appreciate your answer, because those are some of the ideas that I've come up across is like having feasts and gatherings and kind of presenting the findings and stuff like that. And so I think that it also kind of offers opportunities for new projects or new ideas. Like, well, maybe next time you could try this perspective or try this. So I appreciate that. And just to segue, there's a comment question by Marina Juarez. Sorry if I butchered your name, but how does traditional use of herbs fit in with mental health? It's a really good question.
That is a great question. Thanks for asking that. And I can't say that I really know how to answer that. The thing about traditional healing systems and frameworks is they are often not always entirely commensurable. It's hard to figure out how they integrate, and if they integrate, sometimes they're distinctive and hard to know how to integrate. And so there are people who have this expertise. I think of my colleague Rosalind Lapierre, who's a professor at University of Montana. She's Blackfeet and Métis. And as a Blackfeet woman, she learned a lot from her grandmother about traditional plant knowledge and that these plants are used for this and this for that. And she's written a whole book about her kind of experience. So if you're interested, you could look at Rosalind Lapierre's latest book on this topic with traditional plant medicines. But that work usually isn't done in a way that interfaces with mental health per se. So I'm not sure what we really know. And the point of these systems may not being reconcilable is, if you're gathering plants and using plants from an indigenous frame of reference, it's probably not the standard scientific mechanistic frame of reference where there's this, inert substance that, interacts with our bodily biology that changes things for the better. And all the examples I know of, it's a relationship to a person, to beings, plant beings in this case, that has to be ceremonially acknowledged. And the medicine won't work if it's disrespected, for example, or if it's not used in a proper ceremonial protocol with the right rites to do it. And so in that sense, that's very different than the scientific approach, which would tend to like go down to the Amazon, try to find out what indigenous people down there believe are the plants that work, and then take it home to the lab and run all kinds of tests and isolate the compound that has the therapeutic effect, and then figure out how to make it into a pill, get the FDA, persuade the FDA that it should be marketed, and then sell it. And that's how kind of obviously that's tied up in making money in kind of a capitalist frame of reference, but it's also a very mechanistic frame of reference in which, it's just pure biology. And that's really different. So putting those two together strikes me as very challenging. I will say that this past fall, we held at the University of Colorado with sponsorship from the National Institutes of Health, Tribal Research Office, and IHS and the CDC, a traditional medicine summit where we gathered 30 medicine people from different tribes in the country to try to start talking about some of these issues. And it was just the beginning of a conversation. So I don't think there are answers yet, particularly with mental health. But anyway, those are the kind of conversations that I think have to happen before we'd even be able to answer the kind of question that has been asked, which is a great question.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to add too is just how complicated that type of research can be, as far as the herbal remedies that can also have medicinal values to a certain group of people, and how hard, especially with the changing climate and access, like these arbitrary access points, where if that is something that is researched and found upon by an outside of the group or outside of the community member, then that could be very exploitive and very harmful to the amount of resources that those indigenous people already have to be restricted to. And so I think that's always the challenging part when folks are interested in what herbal remedies are, especially with what's going on today. I feel like hand sanitizer is like a really rare commodity suddenly, and so everyone's trying to find that alternative as far as having that safety, and it's fine. I think that's kind of speaks to a greater issue as far as having a sustainable resource that could continue to protect, and I think it's difficult when there's a lot of different kind of fads, if you will, that can take away from the access of indigenous people who are already restricted, like I had said. And so I think those questions are really interesting, and there's a lot of material, I'm sure, that kind of speaks to that. And I just like to add that just because I think it's important to remember that. And I think there's another question here in the comment by Rachel Sundberg. Do you think there's a space then to work with traditional herb doctors to assist or co-treat clients with Western mental health practices in terms of case planning and staffing as a team?
Another really great question. And that's where some of these complications really have to be sorted out, because the rubber is meeting the road, and you have different systems interfacing where they're not necessarily reconcilable entirely, and where there can be different understandings, and where there are power differences. Obviously, biomedicine has all kinds of authority and power in modern society in a way that traditional approaches don't fully enjoy. And so it's not on even footing in terms of how you would negotiate those kinds of things. The other thing is to recognize that physicians in particular, and by extension health professionals more generally, really have a commitment to first do no harm, which is to say that there's a foundation or a basis to the activities we undertake that is meant to be guided by some way of credentialing knowledge that's reliable and valid and acceptable and usable, versus ideas that might be speculative or not entirely demonstrated or proven or clear even. And so I think the dilemma with the interface you're describing is that some health professionals would be a little reluctant to engage in practices that are recommended by partners who are steeped in knowledges that are unfamiliar to them, and that don't necessarily have the kind of skeptical scientific evaluation to justify the claim itself. If you think about it, these have to do with issues of skepticism and its proper role in a health world of alternative health where there are a million claims. As you all know, there are people right now, hucksters who are trying to take advantage of the coronavirus pandemic we're in to market this or sell that in the name that it's going to help you. And, a lot of those don't work or are completely preposterous. Now, who knows? Maybe some of them actually do work. The question becomes, how do we know the difference between what works and doesn't work when it comes to a host of claims? And, biomedicine's answer is, well, science is what helps us sort that out. I don't think that's been a very compelling answer for many indigenous medical practitioners in quite the same way. And so that's one of those areas where I think it's really hard to reconcile. And because of that key difference, I think it would make it hard for some mental health professionals and certainly health professionals to necessarily just take on someone's word, no matter how authoritative that person is in their own community, but absent scientific inquiry, to be willing to kind of accept that it's not going to hurt someone in a way we don't know. And mental health is not immune from this. The dilemma, just very briefly, because I don't want to get off in the weeds here, but in the 1990s in this country, the United States, we had a pandemic of multiple personality disorder. Multiple personality disorder was thought to be this really rare, freakish disorder. And prior to like 1950, or 1960, there were only a few dozen cases, even in the documented medical literature. But by the 1990s, there were tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of mostly women diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. And this arose in part because of the interest in recovering repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse, because multiple personality disorder has long been conceived of as a post-traumatic disorder. And so, through hypnosis or sodium amytal interviewing or, regression therapy, counselors were trying to coax from clients and patients these hidden, buried memories of childhood sexual abuse. And it resulted in this epidemic of reports and claims that then turned into this other set of problems. So that's an example where the mental health system itself can run off the rails if it gets too far away from trying to be a little more skeptical and a little more rigorous in sorting out these claims as to what's what. And that's since been remedied in large part due to science. But there's always going to be claims that outdistance what science can keep up with. And so we're all faced with this kind of dilemma over how much skepticism should we be bringing versus how much credibility or authority should we attribute to someone who's making a claim about our health.
Well said. So one of the last questions, or last question I have, and I think we have a little bit of time left, maybe around 5 minutes. One of the things that I'm wondering is your thoughts about, as a psychologist, as a researcher, academic, and so I don't want to ask you to speak outside of your expertise, but I am curious what you think in these times, in these turbulent times with the coronavirus going around and a lot of changes in our society right now. What do you see as some of the biggest concerns that these changes, how they will impact Indian country? And what are some of the things we can do as community members, as leaders in our community, to advocate for or help to resist further negative consequences? And so, the question is, what do you see as some of the biggest concerns during these times for Indian country?
Yeah, right. That's the question that we all want to really be thinking about. And the thing that comes to mind first and foremost is economy. Our communities, our populations are on the edge of a knife around how vulnerable and the lives of precarity that we live, where even small disruptions can have really big consequences. They get magnified. And I think something like the coronavirus is deeply scary for communities characterized by poverty. I mean, just, our impoverishment, our colonial impoverishment, the plundering of our lands and resources has left us with so little and by way of the ability to take care of ourselves in a situation like this that's so unexpected and so pervasive that it's just very frightening. And, so on my reservation, like on lots of reservations, there isn't enough housing. So, you can be on the housing list for 20 years and still never get a place to live. So where do you live? Well, you camp with, relatives. You might stay with this one for a while till that kind of gets worn out. Then you go to the next one. You make the rounds. You're kind of itinerant in that respect. Well, social distancing, how are you supposed to observe those strictures when there's 10 people living in your house, or when someone you love and care about, our extended families in the way I've been talking about, needs a place to stay? You're not really going to tell them, no, you can't stay here. We have to be distanced. So that puts us at risk, for example, of getting sick. And then the biggest concern with flattening the curve, as I said, which means trying to make sure that the rise of infection doesn't overrun the hospital care system. Think about our hospital care system in most of our communities, really limited. I mean, the IHS is funded at, they used to say like 40 cents on the dollar. I think maybe it's a little better now. Maybe it's 55 cents on the dollar or something like that. But, our healthcare is underfunded, which means we don't have the resources, even the best of times, to meet all of our needs. With contract care, people who are sick have to wait till next year and hope they can get in line to be sent out for that, specialist to help with their problems. Meanwhile, in the face of a pandemic, what are we supposed to do when there's the need for, ventilators and emergency room care and all of the kind of stuff that for some of us who live in hyper rural environments in Indian country is just going to be really overwhelming. So I think it's pretty scary. And I think that there are deeply seated cultural norms that are going to abut the best public health advice around social distancing. It has to do with that sense of distributed identity. If you are not just you encased in your body, but you are a family or a group of loved ones, there's no such thing as distancing from those people in a way that's nice and neat and not full of conflict and predicament. So I think these are the kinds of things that probably make sense. So if I think about what should we be thinking about in the time of pandemic, it has to do with the economy, but I think in general, it has to do with the fact that our poverty puts us at great risk always. And, one thing we can do, it's a simple, straightforward thing. It's also a little bit limited, is to make sure that this country has a better safety net. The political right doesn't believe in big government. The political right doesn't believe in paying in taxes. And that all is necessary, actually, to have the kind of safety net that will protect the most vulnerable populations when it comes to income and poverty. And so it's not surprising that after hollowing out the federal government and closing down this office and failing to appoint, several hundred political appointees that run the federal government, that this administration can't respond to this pandemic with the nimbleness that's required to prevent a bunch of people from dying. And that's in mainstream America. Think about what's going to, what our communities will be facing in those circumstances. So we need a better safety net, which means we need a greater investment in the public good and in government as offering important solutions and in taking care of the most vulnerable and the most impoverished among us.
Thank you. That was well said.
There's another question in the comments I think is a really good one. I don't know how much time we have left, but I reckon we have one. Given the diversities across American Indian cultures, do you think a cross-cultural assessment for clients can be developed to effectively guide selection of therapeutic approaches, conceptualizing etiology, treatment targeting, conceptualizing therapeutic change mechanisms, and outcome measurements?
Yeah, that's a very specific question, but it's a good one. I think the diversity isn't a problem if the kind of screening and assessment and treatment planning and so on of the level of clinical practice can be done at an order of abstraction that allows for flexible understanding within it. So, you can ask people a question like, are there any cultural practices that you think would be helpful to you in this time of distress? You don't have to say is a sweat lodge what you need? Or do we need to offer corn pollen? Or do we, those kinds of things? That's too specific because that's where you have that diversity. But if you ask at the higher order of analysis, like, cultural practices, ceremonial practices, are there prayer or are there people you can turn to? We don't have to say who those people are, but we could just solicit that. So open-ended questions at a level of abstraction that's just high enough not to foreclose on those diverse possibilities can help to, I think, manage some of that diversity in important ways. Now, what that requires in part, though, is that mental health professionals who are working in any given locale and with different kinds of people have to have some sense of what is available, so ideally, if you're working with any number of Native clients, you know something about the local Native community. And so you're aware of what the resources might be for gathering, for seeking prayer and support, et cetera. The traditions that are kind of more prevalent in those areas, so that you're, conversant and a little fluent in it. Not that you're going to practice those things. I mean, these could be white mental health professionals who aren't in a position to do any of that, but at least they're knowledgeable enough to be conversant with someone and thinking about resources, because that's really what this comes back to, is people who are suffering and going through a rough time and deep distress, or their life has become so full of challenges that they're overwhelmed, they're in a predicament that they don't know how to solve. What they need is compassion and help with the problem solving and connection to lots of other resources and supports. And so if you don't know the other resources and supports for your clients, obviously you're missing out on the opportunity to reach them better. And it can be done, again, at the order of abstraction that allows for that diversity to play out in that specific local form without over determining what it is they have to do specifically.
Yeah, it's a really good answer to a really good question by Garcia Drew. I don't know if I mentioned who had asked that question, but I think it's important. And I think that's all the questions, although there are a lot of really good comments that talk about specifically the Maori worldviews, which I always am a fan of what they do over there. I think they do a lot of innovative work that we could always use to kind of adapt to our own traditional values. So I will say that. Virgil, was there anything else that we kind of wanted to talk over before?
No, just thank you, Dr. Gahn and Charlie, and Two Feathers Live speaker series. Will be back at it on Monday with the executive director of the Seventh Generation Fund, Tia Peters. And thank everybody for, viewing. And this will also be posted on our YouTube channel, and it's on Facebook.
Yeah, Yotwa.
Thanks, Charlie. Good to event you. Thanks, Dr. Moorhead. So good to spend time with you again. Thanks to all who turned in. And if you ever want to get a hold of me, by the way, on my website I gave on the PowerPoint, you can also email me. I'll certainly try to answer when I have time. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good one.
So long.